Welcome to Neue Center Science Talk. Thank you all for being here this evening. I would like to introduce our speaker, Roxanne Beltran. Roxanne is Assistant Professor of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at UC Santa Cruz. And yes, again, we are honored to have you here, Roxanne. So thank you again. And take it away.
Yeah, once again, thank you all for being here. My name is Roxanne. I'm a professor at UC Santa Cruz, and I run a lab of researchers, young researchers, graduate students, postdocs, and some undergraduate student researchers to study the elephant seals at Año Nuevo. And so we work a lot December through June on the elephant seals doing field work, and the summer is sort of the time we take a step back and do some research and do some thinking and some reorganizing. And so it's a really amazing time to be able to share some of the research with you that we've been doing over the last few years. I want to start a little bit broader than elephant seals and talk about living animals generally, which have huge ecological impacts. If you think of any animal from, an eagle to a fish to a turkey, all these animals are doing things all the time, like migrating and feeding and molting and reproducing and socializing, that are not only important for those animals for their survival and for persistence of their populations, but also because they play really important ecological roles, right? They play really important roles in ecosystems. And that's through things like recycling nutrients. Like when animals move through vast spaces, they move things, they poop in different places, they feed in different places. And so they're moving really important nutrients. They're also depleting prey. They're offloading contaminants like mercury and PCBs. They're connecting different populations through gene flow. They're transmitting pathogens like zoonotic diseases sometimes. And all of these are really important, not only for ecosystem functioning, but for how we as humans also interact with those ecosystems. But for those animals to have those ecological impacts, they have to be alive. And so one of the things that we study a lot in my lab is how animals stay alive, and in particular, how it is that they end up dying. So Sarah talked a little bit about some of the strandings that happen where animals are coming to the beach and they're dead, and we can try to figure out what caused their death or what we can maybe do to prevent it in the future. So I want to give you guys a pop quiz and ask how animals in a couple slides typically die. And the point is to basically show you that it's really hard to study causes of death in wild animals. So let me give you this first example. This is an octopus. And if you've seen My Octopus is Teacher, you probably have some idea for how octopuses might die. So let's see, I can't actually see you guys. So maybe we'll do like a little show of hands if you know how to raise your hand at the bottom of your Zoom bar. Raise your hand if you think that they often die of predation. Do octopuses die of predation? Okay. We have a few hands. Okay. What about starvation? Raise your hand if you think octopuses starve sometimes. Okay, a couple hands. Okay, what about old age? Do we think octopuses die from old age? Haha, yeah, there's all the hands. Yeah, totally. Yes. So the correct answer is that octopuses die of all three of these causes. But if you've seen My Octopus Teacher, you probably know that a lot of times these particular animals die of old age. That's not the case with all animals, right? How about impala? Have you ever seen like a David Attenborough documentary where an impala is being chased like a predator? So you might make the assumption in that case that impalas die a lot from predation instead of things like old age or starvation. And if you've seen like a polar bear on an ice floe, one of those dramatic climate change pictures that makes you worried that no polar bear is ever going to be able to find enough food to be able to eat, you might think about starvation as the main cause of mortality in polar bears. And once again, I give those examples to show you that all of these things are possible, right? Like a polar bear has definitely died from predation, one has died from starvation, one has died from old age. All of these things happen all the time. But our perception of the causes of mortality are not always exactly accurate. They're biased by the lens through which we see the natural world, through us watching documentaries or watching movies or having experiences or seeing things firsthand. But what about for animals that we can't observe all the time? Some other folks have done some really excellent work on causes of mortality in wild animals. And this is a review that they did showing all the causes of mortality of terrestrial mammals and birds. And so what you can see here is that a lot of the mortality causes are from predation. That's that blue box. A lot is also through other causes or through human harvest. Starvation plays a really minor role in mortality of terrestrial mammals and birds, at least how we study it. But if you ask the same question of marine vertebrates, you don't know the answer because lots of marine vertebrates spend a ton of time really far away from where we can observe them. And so we literally don't know how most marine vertebrates die, whether it's starvation, whether it's predation, whether it's human harvest, or whether it's some other cause like an illness that's running through the population or competition or something like that, that causes the predominant mortality sources for marine vertebrates. And that brings me to elephant seals. So that's one of the reasons why I'm really interested in studying elephant seals is because we can get quite a bit of information about their survival and about their mortality. One of the things that I find super interesting is about the lifespan or longevity of wild animals. So for elephant seals, we know they can live to be 23 years old, but on average, they only live to be about 1.4 years old. So there's a huge difference between the potential maximum lifespan and the average lifespan of this species. And the same is true for lots of other wild animals. So here's a little brown bat that can live to be 34 years old, but on average lives to be only 2.2 years old. And that's in really stark contrast to things like domesticated animals and humans that often live a really long proportion of their potential maximum lifespans. And if you think about it, you can probably reason why that is. It's because, those humans and those dogs, they don't have a lot of the same selection pressures like predators and like starvation that the wild animals do. And therefore, a lot of us and a lot of our pets live to, this is Spot, my cat, live to be a really long proportion of their potential lifespan. And I think for me, that begs the question of what can animals do to stay alive? If most of them don't live as long as they possibly could, then how is it that some animals live a really long time and others live really short lifespans? And we can look to a lot of different sources of variation across individuals in order to find answers to these things. So like you and I are pretty different pets are pretty different in their personalities and their size. Wild animals are really different from each other. So things like body size and different anatomical features, their physiology performance can be really different. Their behavior can be really different across individuals. Things like ecology and evolution can also be really different. And these differences in animals can basically cause room for natural selection if, for example, one reproductive strategy is better than another. Then the animals that have that reproductive strategy will tend to survive, and they may tend to pass that reproductive strategy onto their offspring so that it will persist in the population. And so a lot of the work that my lab does is trying to measure these different, what we call traits or characteristics of animals, and trying to understand how those traits make some individuals much more successful than other individuals. A lot of the ways that we study these traits are through a technique that's called biologging or attaching instruments to animals. So what you're seeing here is migrations of like hundreds of thousands of mammals and birds that are carrying these really small instruments called satellite tags that basically transmit information about the animal's whereabouts to a satellite that then sends that information back to our computers. So I'll say this again at the end of the talk, but if you go to my lab website, you can literally watch the live tracking data of the elephant seals that we've instrumented, and you can see what they do throughout their migrations. And so we can take this biologging data and get a lot of useful information about it. I recently traveled to Japan to give a keynote talk at the International Biologging Symposium, and I gave this figure as sort of the prime keynote figure, which basically shows the sort of promise and applicability of biologging tools. So I'll walk you through it. On the left side is the different biomes, right? Can you see my mouse, Sarah? I circle around here. Okay. So here you can see land, you can see sky, and you can see sea. All these animals are carrying little miniature biologgers. So those biologgers can measure across lots of different habitats. They can also measure lots of different disciplines. So those are the different colors. Things like demography, like survival and reproductive success, those can be measured using those instruments. Things like physiology, like when animals are sleeping or what their sensory perception is, like what they can hear and see. It can measure their behavior, like their feeding success. It can measure how social they are and how they move with other animals in their same species, how they interact across species. And so it's not just the disciplines that it can measure, but it can measure different like scales too, from the individual, which is here in this blue box, to the population, to the community, and all the way to the ecosystem. And then what I'm particularly interested is actually connecting these boxes. And that's what all the white things are. Those are ecological theories. So ecological theories help us understand how the world works. If we study, let's say, an elephant seal and ask a single question, we can sort of take a step back and generalize the answer to other species. So I'm going to give you an example later of something called state-dependent risk-taking, which is this white box down here. And as you can see, that basically connects activity budgets, so what animals are doing, energy expenditure, how much they're spending, and sleep and body condition. And the idea is basically that animals that are in worse body condition will take more risks because they're more desperate to be able to do something to be able to gain fat. And in the case of the elephant seal, I'll show you later, that means if they're skinnier, they take more risks when they're sleeping. So they actually make themselves like more available to be eaten by white sharks when they're skinnier, because they're trying to sort of like shuffle around their risks and the rewards that they're willing to take. So all that to say, biologging is a really promising tool. By attaching these small instruments to animals, we can measure across land, sea, and sky. We can measure across disciplines, and we can measure across scales to make these really generalizable insights about how nature works. And so we have a paper, it's a preprint right now, it's in revision at a peer-reviewed journal that basically it's called Biologging for the Future. It's sort of the vision of how these biologgers can help us solve fundamental questions from individuals to ecosystems. And if you scan the QR code, or maybe Sarah can send an email out later, I'm happy to share the link to that paper with you. Okay, so we're going to get into elephant seals here. So Sarah mentioned that I run the research program at Año Nuevo, where my lab works. This is me with one of those giant bulls that apparently you're going to have a skeleton from. That's my husband backing down the bull so that I can weigh the pup. So basically what we do is we very carefully put the pup after it weans from its mom into this bag. And then we carefully weigh the pup by suspending it from a tripod that's attached to a scale. We add a flipper tag to that pup's rear flipper, and that becomes its identity for the rest of its life. And then we go out every day from December through June, and actually September through June, and we go and try to find those animals. And it sounds a little bit tricky, but the seals are actually pretty docile. So you can literally walk up to them. There's one with a little dye mark on her side. So that's 4235. That's the number that's on her flipper tag. And we've written it on her side with dye so we can find her again. That's her pup, you can see, with that dark black coat. And you'll see some footage here pretty soon of us just walking through the colony. And when they're asleep, and especially during the breeding season, when they're tired, you can literally just walk around and study them. And they're pretty accessible. So as far as marine mammals go, this is probably like one of the most easiest species to study, and it makes it so that we can get a lot of really useful information about them. So what does that information actually look like? I told you that we give each seal a unique ID. This particular one is B95. And then every time we observe her, we enter her observation into a database. And so, for example, she was born in 2015. So this slide's a little old. I think she's now 9 years old. But you can see exactly how many times she was seen each year. And every time we see her, we make notes about things like when we saw her and where we saw her and whether she was with a pup or how molted she was. And then based on that information, we can accumulate lots of information over time. So I'm actually the third principal investigator in a long line, starting with Bernie LeBeuf in the 1960s and then Dan Costa in the 1990s. And he was my undergraduate mentor. And so I'm basically inheriting this incredible data set from those two PIs. And between the two of them, they've been studying the elephant seals for 6 decades. And 50,000 seals have been tagged and observed about 360,000 times. So I'm sort of starting my career with this absolute goldmine of data set, and I'm able to do a lot of really cool stuff with it, which I'm really excited about. one of the reasons that they were so focused on doing those observations, they're called mark recapture, when you like tag and then re-observe an animal later, is that when we attach instruments or biologgers to the seals like this one, we want to attach them to the seals that are definitely going to survive and definitely going to come back so that we can get the data back and we can get our like $5,000 instrument back. And so we can not only instrument those particular seals, but we can also measure them. So this is what they look like when they depart the beach at their skinniest. And then this is what they look like when they come back. So you should be able to see that seals gained about 200 kilograms of body mass from foraging out in the North Pacific Ocean. And I often get a question about whether, attaching instruments to these animals hurts them at all or changes their natural behavior. And so I want to show you a little bit of work that my PhD student, Allison Payne, has led, all about the impacts of biologgers on wildlife and how we can strategically minimize those impacts using best practices. So she basically said, okay, for animals that walk or swim or fly, what are the main consequences of biologgers on those animals? So for example, you can imagine for swimmers, like drag is really important, right? Dragging something through the water column. And so you want to make things as streamlined as possible. Whereas for a species that walks, that's not as important. But walking species often carry collars for the biologgers instead of like them being glued on. And that can either rub their skin, or if, not done properly, if it's too loose, it can catch on things like branches. And so she's thought really carefully about how biologgers can be designed and attached to animals in order to minimize those impacts and to make sure that, the metrics that we're trying to measure are not being impacted by the methods that we're using to measure them. And we've basically been able to sort of reflect on our elephant seal program and say, hey, what impacts are we having on these elephant seals, and how do we make sure that we're minimizing those impacts, so we can do the best science that we can do. The other thing I want to talk about, and then I'll get into the research, is just how important it is for my lab that we do a lot of undergraduate student mentoring. So we recently had a paper accepted in Ecology Letters that was actually co-authored by me, my postdocs, my grad students, and my undergrads, about how long-term monitoring studies in ecology, like the elephant seal program, can really promote inclusive training experiences for students. And what we show in this paper is that it's really a two-way road. It's a positive feedback loop where the students are able to contribute their time. They're able to, help us with whether it's finding new ideas or giving us feedback on our research. But in turn, they're able to get data for independent projects, and they're able to get training opportunities, and they're able to see how research happens firsthand. And so it's really a win-win situation for us to be able to work with students. And it's one of the most, I think, rewarding parts of my job. So I always like to mention that, to say a lot of the data that I'm showing here are either co-published by undergraduate students or were done as part of an undergraduate student research experience. And that's a really important part of our program as well. Okay, so we are going to move into the science piece of it, and we don't have to get through all this. So like I said, if you have questions, feel free to pop them in the chat and I'll pause. But I want to try to get through 3 research vignettes today that sort of follow on this theme of fitness consequences of like mortality and survival and what animals can do to stay alive. So the first one, my cat is in a playful mood and this is scary. The first one is the fitness consequences of life history timing. So all about the annual cycle and how that's scheduled. The second one is about the fitness consequences of behavioral strategies. That's the one I was talking about relative to sleep, when and where elephant seals sleep. And the third is about the fitness consequences of ocean conditions. So how can things like El Nino or the Pacific Decadal Oscillation impact how successful seals are? And I'll walk you through one of these at a time, starting with the annual cycle. This figure is pretty complicated, so I'm not going to dwell on it too much, but I mostly just want to say that all of the seasonal activities that I told you about at the beginning, like when animals migrate and when they reproduce, those can happen in one of 2 ways. They can either be really synchronous, or they can be really staggered across individuals. So in some species, some things are really synchronous. All animals, things happen at the same time. Like this is the week that they breed and that is it. And then sometimes it's really staggered, where like an animal will finish doing something before another animal even starts it. And so one of our goals is to figure out like which of these activities is staggered versus synchronous. And there's a lot of really important implications for the answer to that question. Like you can imagine let's just talk about like transmitting pathogens like COVID. If COVID's a bad example. Avian flu. You guys have probably heard about the avian flu outbreaks that are happening. So if all the animals are super staggered in when they show up at an island, if one's infected with avian flu, it might not infect that many other animals. But if they all have super synchronous timing, then potentially they could all get infected at the same time, right? So understanding when these things happen across individuals is really, really important for lots of reasons. I am just going to talk about the molts today. So for those of you who have a cat or a dog and you have fur all over you all the time, you probably know a little something about the molts, but molts is basically when fur for mammals or when feathers for birds are replaced. It usually happens about once a year. In wild mammals, it's often like over a couple months. In cats and dogs, it's like a little bit seasonal, but kind of happens throughout the year. In elephant seals, the molt is this crazy process where they actually peel all of the skin on their whole body and their fur, and it all drops off. So this is pictures of what that looks like. The bottom picture is a 5% molted seal, so you can see the like new fur starting to come in on the muzzle. The middle picture is 50% molt, so you can see that old fur kind of starting to peel away on the head. And then the last picture is 95% molted. And so we literally walk around the beach and write down like the tag number and then how molted we think the animal is. And we can use that information to pick different annual cycle events and figure out when they are. So go ahead and look at the right side of the plot. Here we have day of the year. This is the spring. It's in like April and May. On the y-axis, we have the percent of the body that's molted. And so what you can see is that the animal arrives here, is 0% molted for about 15 days, and then starts to molt and goes from like 0 to 25 to 75 to 100% molted in the span of about a week, and then stays 100% molted for the rest of her time at the beach at Año Nuevo. And so, the arrival date is that first dot, the departure date is that last dot. And then between the two, we basically calculate molt start and molt end based on the progression of the fur loss patterns. And so we can take those 4 points and basically plot them on this annual cycle. So to orient you to this figure here, we've just finished, we're like here, like June 30th-ish. So the molt just finished. So they all arrived in like April or May, and then they started their molt, finished it, and then they all left. But this is like a classic misrepresentation of animals. Like if someone asks you, when are the blue whales in the bay? Or when are the blue whales along the coast? You're probably like, oh, this month or this month. It's like very classic where we just lump all the seals or all the whales together and say, this is when they're here. But are they really here that whole time? Like if elephant seals are molting on the beach for 2 months, is one seal actually there for 2 months? Or is it that each seal is there for a week, but they stagger their arrival? Those are really different answers. And so we wanted to figure out what the answer was. This is 484 seals worth of data. And so on the x-axis is date again, like this is the spring. Basically all of the seals are just stacked all on top of each other, sorted by when they started their molt. And so what I want you to see is that it's pretty staggered, right? So on average, the arrival date ranged like 80 days between different seals. The molt itself, so the difference between like the darker green here and the lighter green here is only about 7 days. So there's a huge amount of variation in when they're doing the molt, and it's a pretty short period of time. And so if you're interested in checking out that paper, it just came out a few months ago. It's called Individual Variation in Life History Timing, and it's all about how they show up at similar times, but they're really asynchronous and when they actually molt. And I don't have time to go over it today, but I just want to say that there's this really cool finding in that paper called phenological compensation, which basically means that when seals get late, they speed up in order to catch up to the rest of the seals. So if they molt really, really late, they molt quicker, and that molt haul out period is a lot shorter so that they can basically like get back on track with their annual cycle. And that's, I think, one of the mechanisms that seals and lots of other animals are going to have to rely on really heavily when climate change happens and all the timing gets messed up with everything. They're going to have to compensate their timing. And so the fact that we show that in elephant seals is pretty cool and pretty fun for me. Okay, so I talked about molt and when that happens. I want to talk a little bit about the breeding season. So one of our curiosities was, when does the breeding season actually happen? basically they leave for that long foraging trip around mid-June. And then it's a 7-month trip. So it goes July, August, September, October, November, December, and then they come back at the very beginning of January in order to give birth to their pups. So 7-month migration out in the open ocean. And one of the questions that we had was basically like, when does the birth timing happen relative to when they arrive? And it turns out it's only 5 days later. So they go on these 7-month migrations when they're pregnant. And then there's only 5 days in between when they haul out on the beach and when they give birth to a pup, which is absolutely incredible. I want to show you what those foraging migrations look like. So this is departing the beach at Año Nuevo and then returning back to the beach at Año Nuevo. And I guess I'll show you this figure really quick because it's complicated, but it's one of my favorite figures. The figure on the right shows the population ranges of some of the life history events across the year. So remember I showed you how there's like a ton, like 80 days of variation in the molt, but there's very little variation in the breeding season. When they arrive, they give birth, they wean their pups, and then they depart for that short trip to sea. Look how skinny those range bars are relative to the molt. And so you can look at these incredible foraging migrations and say, well, how is it that they end up coming back to the beach on time in order to give birth just 5 days after they arrive? It's pretty insane. And I had an undergraduate student, Alex Yuen, who basically figured out the answer to that question. So what he did was he figured out when elephant seals turn around. So as you saw in the video, they go out, they forage, and then they turn around and come back to the colony. So he basically said, okay, at the start of their trip, which is here, they're 0 kilometers from Año Nuevo. Then that distance increases every day. They stay out of their foraging ground, and then they come back to the colony and they're back at 0 kilometers from the colony at 0 days before birth. So he found these turnaround points. He found the point at which seals were no longer going farther away. Instead, they were just coming back. And he found that for all the seals and was like, okay, are they turning around at a certain location? And you can see this map says very clearly no. Are they turning around at a certain time? Also no. It turns out that they turn around strategically based on how far away they are in order to be able to get back on time. This is another example of this phenological compensation. It's not a certain time. It's not a certain place that seals turn around. Their turnaround distance, which is here on the x-axis, depends on their turnaround date and vice versa. So if they have farther to go, they leave earlier. It's like if I'm going to drive up to where you guys are and I'm leaving from San Francisco or I'm leaving from Santa Cruz, I'm going to leave at very different times, right? To do that mental math and say, when do I need to leave in order to get there on time, given that I can't go faster than 70 miles an hour on the highway? And it looks like seals are doing the same thing, right? They have this maximum speed of 100 kilometers per day. So if they have 5,000 kilometers to cover before they make it back to the beach, then they're going to leave 250 days before birth in order to make it back on time. And so again, this is all published. And so if you're interested in seeing it, it's a paper called Elephant Seals Account for Time and Space During Long Distance Migrations. And what we say is basically that it shows how they're able to get back to the breeding beach on time and how they're able to be synchronous across individuals. All right. I'll go through this one quickly. So the next one is about the fitness consequences of behavioral strategies. And this is work that I did with my former postdoc, made the cover of Ecology letters. And I'll just give you the spoiler alert. We basically find that animals that do certain behavioral strategies at sea have a lot more survival and reproductive success. So I'll skip the details here just for time and basically show you this plot to show you there's sort of behavioral strategies that some seals use. So here each seal is a dot. On the x-axis, we have how deep they forage on average. On the y-axis, we have how much mass they gain from eating fish, how far they forage from the coast, when they leave, and how much fish they have in their diet. And the blue lines basically means there's a statistically significant relationship between two things. And so basically seals that dive deeper also forage farther from the coast and eat more fish. And we found that those seals also gain more mass. So there are certain strategies like I said at the beginning, that allow some seals to be more successful than other seals. And we also found that mass gain, so foraging success during that trip, has a lot to do with their probability of surviving that trip. So each of these lines is like an average age. I put the old seals on here just so you could see the whole line is shifted down. They have a much lower chance of surviving when they're really old. But I want you to focus on is the positive slope of that line. So if seals gain like 300 kilograms during that foraging trip when they're pregnant, then their chance of survival is like, 85%. If they only gain 100 kilograms during that foraging trip, if they're less successful, their chance of survival is only like 60%. So they get a little bit of a boost in survival chances when they gain more mass. And that to me says that starvation may be playing a role in mediating survival of these seals. The super interesting thing that we found was that the probability of reproduction for the animals that survived was much higher at higher levels of mass gain than seals that gained less mass. So for seals that gained 300 kilograms of mass, they almost always successfully produced a pup that breeding season. For the seals that gained less than 200 kilograms, they almost never produced a pup during that breeding season. And we call this a physiological tipping point. Basically, like small changes in mass gain can lead to really big changes in how successful the seals are at producing pups. And if you take these two things together, the fact that they survive more and they reproduce more when they gain more mass, we can create these sort of lifetime fitness consequences maps. So on the x-axis, again, we have how much mass they gain. On the y-axis, in this case, is reproductive lifespan, how many years they live after they become reproductively mature. And you see, again, there's a slight increase in that lifespan as a function of mass gain. But the big, big difference is a lot more lifetime reproductive success for seals that gain more mass. So I'll show you the conceptual figure because it's a little simpler. There are behavioral strategies. They lead to differences in foraging success in terms of mass gain, and that has benefits for both reproduction and survival. And so we were sort of able to link all of those things to get some more insight into how it is that seals are able to make a living. And to me, this showed, like I said, that starvation is probably playing a little bit of a role in the fact that, all of these strategies seem to help mass gain, and mass gain seems to be really beneficial for survival. And there's a predator story. And so this is the one I alluded to at the beginning. So when seals are at sea, they're doing one of two things. They're either resting or they're feeding. They can decide between those two things at any given time. Do I want to feed or do I want to rest? Feeding is a really high reward activity, right? It's the way that they gain energy through consuming fishes and some squid. Resting, on the other hand, is a really high risk activity where they, like us, sleep with both hemispheres of their brain. And what that means is that, they can't like detect predators. And so when they're asleep, it's a lot more risky. And so they're always trying to sort of balance these two things. Like, I'm tired, but resting will mean that I expose myself to predators. I'm hungry, and so I want to feed. There's a little complication to the story, which is that their predators, white sharks and killer whales, both use high light levels in order to feed. And so for seals, daytime is really risky because during the day, there's a lot of light levels in the ocean. It means the killer whales and the white sharks are much better at seeing the seals and predating them. And also, shallower ocean water is really risky because it's also more light. The deeper you go in the ocean, the darker it is. So if you're a seal, the absolutely safest place you can be is deep in the water column at night. And the absolutely worst place you can be, especially if you're sleeping with both hemispheres of your brain, is during the daytime in shallow waters. And so I want to show you this video that basically puts together the whole story of this research paper to show how seals avoid predation by white sharks and killer whales by navigating what I call the lightscape of fear, which is sort of a play on the landscape of fear where animals are constantly worrying about the predators that are around them. So I'll go ahead and play this video. All right. So, do elephant seals die of starvation or predation? I don't know. I'm going to tease you on that one. We have a massive project going on right now trying to answer that exact question, and I'll know more in a few years, but I'll give you the sneak peek that it seems like juveniles are doing a lot of starving, and I think that's probably not the case in adults as much. So I think we're seeing a switch in the causes of mortality from juveniles to adults that might explain some of the patterns that we're seeing. And yeah, you'll just have to come find me and learn more in a couple years. All right. I do want to talk a little bit about ocean conditions, and I don't have a ton of time, so I think I'm going to skip the juvenile development stuff and talk about this last research project that I'm really excited about, which is really, I think, some of the most impactful research that we've ever done in my lab group, and it stemmed from an undergraduate class. So for those of you who are educators, you might have heard of course-based undergraduate research experiences. They're a big deal in higher education right now, and the idea is that within a course, within an undergraduate course, you give students a research experience. And it's not just a fake, pretend like lab exercise where you're, I don't know, like creating some organic compound for the 75,000th time that someone has done it. It's like you're doing a real research project that has real applications for whatever. And so in this upper division field class that I teach, we do this every year. We decide as a class on a research paper that we want to write, and we write a peer-reviewed publication with the students. We divide them up into small groups, and then they put the small group projects together. And then at the end of the quarter, the summer after, we write the paper. And in 2022, they decided they wanted to think about how ocean conditions impacted seal success. And so we picked 7 metrics. I'm going to show you just one of them, which is the number of seals born in each cohort that live long enough to produce pups of their own, which is called recruitment. And so we use the long-term data set all the way from the late 1970s all the way up to 2015. We said, okay, of the 500, let's say 250 female elephant seal pups that are born in each cohort, what proportion of them survive long enough to give birth to their own pups? And you can see a huge amount of variation, right? So like in this really, really good year, 30% of the seals recruited. In this really bad year, only 5% did. So we're seeing a 6-fold difference in the recruitment success across different elephant seal cohorts. These are all cohorts born at Año Nuevo. They're all tracked throughout their whole lives. And it just so happens that some of them are 5 times better than others. And the student said, well, these are marine predators. They rely on marine resources. It ought to be the oceanographic conditions that are driving these patterns. And sure enough, they went and found some oceanographic indices. So these are satellite measured oceanographic conditions that describe relative productivity of the ocean. I hesitate to say productivity because it's literally measurements of physical oceanography, like sea surface temperature and sea surface height. But supposedly these inform how healthy the ocean is. And what they found is that, of course, during the absolute bad years, it's really bad ocean conditions. And during the really good years, it's really good ocean conditions. And so we built a whole research project around it. First, we looked at how oceanographic conditions link up to maternal mass gain. So remember, the seals are pregnant, the females are pregnant during the 7-month migration. They're out at sea foraging and they come back, and that mass gain is really important for their survival and their reproductive success. And we basically found that oceanographic conditions are very predictive of how much mass the seals gain during that foraging trip. You can ignore this middle one. It's a PDO is negative in terms of like negative values are better, but in all of these, better ocean conditions mean better seal foraging. And better seal foraging means heavier pups. And heavier pups in turn are a lot better. So pups that have heavier weaning masses also have higher first-year survival and also have higher recruitment success. And all of these are driven by the oceanographic conditions. 3 indices: the North Pacific Gyre Oscillation, which is this one, the Southern Oscillation Index, which is sort of similar to El Nino that you've heard of, and then the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. All of these things are predictive of seal quality through their influence on how much body mass the moms gain during their foraging trips. So what we've basically shown is that we can link all the way from physical oceanographic conditions measured by satellites to mass gain of seals to the size and quality of their pups, all the way up to their pups' lifetime qualities. And for that reason, we call elephant seals ecosystem sentinels of the North Pacific Ocean. They can give us information about the health of the ocean in ways that nothing has ever been able to do before. And so I opened with showing you how living animals move through space and how they behave and how that has, um, implications for like how we understand the natural world, how pathogens are transmitted, how contaminants are offloaded. And I want to add to this the idea that these animals moving through these spaces and showing us the health of ecosystems can serve as really important sentinels, can help us understand processes in the natural world that we can't measure in any other way. I want to go back and answer Sharon's question real quick, which is what are the factors used to measure ocean conditions? It's a really good question because um, measuring ocean conditions is hard. We have a lot of constraints on our ability to measure the ocean. There's different technologies and all of them have constraints. Like ships are awesome because they can go really long distances, they can carry lots of equipment. They're super expensive. And one ship is pretty constrained in its like spatial range. Satellites provide a really good, like broad scale and fine resolution look at physical ocean conditions. So these particular ones are all about like sea surface temperature, sea surface height. We can measure things like salinity. We can measure things like chlorophyll, which is like primary productivity. All of those can be measured through satellites, but the satellites can only measure like the top 1 meter of the water column, and the water column's like 11,000 meters deep at most. So again, we can get some information, but it's not all the information that we need. There are things like buoys and Argo floats and gliders and all these other ocean techniques that can also be used to study the ocean. But again, they have limitations. Like, buoys have to be sort of moored to the seafloor. And so off the continental shelf, you can't do that. There's a lot of things that need to be like tethered to some sort of vessel. And so any way that we measure ocean conditions is incomplete. And, seals are a relatively inexpensive, far ranging, offshore going, deep diving, quiet, remote, reliable platform for carrying instruments. And it's one of the, I think, future directions of my lab group's research is how exactly we can partner with the elephant seals to learn more about ocean conditions and specifically to validate some of the metrics, like the surface metrics that we measure from satellites. We think, for example, that this PDO metric is a good proxy for oceanographic conditions, but we haven't measured like the relative abundance of fish in the twilight zone at 200 to 1,000 meters underwater to pair with the satellite measurements. And so the seals can help us validate the satellite-derived physical oceanographic metrics for understanding the biological metrics at mid-trophic levels, which is something that we couldn't do in any other way. Okay, I have like 2 more slides. I'm gonna get through those and then I'll come back, Laura, to your question about the molt because I think it's a great one. So I just want to summarize and kind of wrap up here what I've shown you today. So we talked about the fitness consequences of life history timing of the annual cycle and when it happens. I've showed you the molt is really asynchronous across individuals, but that it's really short. And that the seals manage to have a very synchronous breeding season because they turn around at a really specific time and based on their distance in order to make it back. I showed you the fitness consequences of behavioral strategies. So I showed you that seals that do certain things like diving deeper and foraging farther offshore and eating more fish have more foraging success and therefore live longer and produce more pups. And that one way they can avoid predation is basically by adjusting when they sleep and where they sleep throughout those migrations. And I've also shown you the fitness consequences of ocean conditions. So I skipped the juvenile part, but showed you that good ocean conditions increase population size and basically like by having more successful cohorts of pups, we know that lots more seals are born, they eat more fish, and they have a lot bigger impact on their ecosystems as well. So we've talked about the 3 things that sort of have implications for fitness consequences. And I just want to say that, this figure is like what population persistence is all about. Which animals are skipping reproductive events, but they're alive, which are reproducing, and which ones are no longer alive, and how specifically are animals transitioning between these categories. So like, when do they go from skip breeding to breeding, or from breeding to dead, or from skip breeding to dead? And specifically, how do ocean conditions mediate those transitions? So in a good year, maybe all the seals get enough mass that they don't have to make these decisions. They don't have to decide between like current and future reproduction, or between current reproduction and future survival. They can just have it all. They can have their cake and eat it too. But in bad conditions, when there's fewer resources and they have reduced foraging success, wild animals often have to choose. It's either you reproduce now or you reproduce next year, or you can reproduce now and next year, but then you won't make it the following year in order to have more pups. And so one of our sort of things that we're going to do in the future, I think, is look at how these environmental conditions mediate trade-offs between survival and reproduction, and what that means for how animals are making their decisions in the wild. We're going to need a lot more things to be able to do that. And it's not just a my research program kind of thing. We're going to need a lot more long-term research programs. We're going to need more technology development so we can measure things like juveniles and males that are a lot harder to study. We're going to need international partnerships to be able to study them in more geographic areas. And we're going to need a lot more data synthesis too, open science and sharing between research groups, so that we can get a more comprehensive picture of how it is that there's so much variation in these fitness consequences, and how we can prevent climate change from having a big impact on how these animals are able to make a living. And then finally, I mentioned this at the beginning, but we do have a lab website, beltranlab.ucsc.edu, and you're welcome to go to it. It has live tracking data. We have 32 plus 14, 46 animals instrumented right now. So you can go ahead and go to that website and check them out, see where they're going. They just left it a month or two ago, so they're really fresh on their migrations. And I forgot to put it in here, and I don't have one right here, but we also recently partnered with Follow, which is a bracelet company that sells bracelets, and you can basically like buy a bracelet and you get tracking data for a seal. It's really fun, and it's like a fundraiser for the Seymour Center, which is our marine science center. So if you go to follow.com, you can buy I think it's called the Glide bracelet. It's like a seal bracelet, which is pretty cool. And then we have a Facebook group as well. So with all that, I want to say thank you so much to my incredible team. They're just super awesome. Everything I showed you today is really a culmination of all these people doing all sorts of great work in all sorts of places around the world, and doing lots of early mornings and late nights of elephant seal field work. So big shout out to them, and to all of our like funders and the field assistants and our education research partners. And then, yeah, I will open it up for any questions. I promise to start with Laura, and then I'll head to the other two. So Laura asks, what is the purpose of the molts? How are the seals protected from UV radiation during this time? And how are they protected from skin parasites and predators? Great question. So seals haul out to molts, so they don't have any land predators. Very different than like an Arctic seal, but elephant seals don't have any predators on land now, which is pretty awesome. The cool thing about elephant seals is that they actually grow in their new fur before they lose their old fur. So it's like their new fur is like pushing through the follicles and pushing off their old fur, and then they peeled off their old fur. The new fur continues to grow after the old fur is lost, but it's not like they're ever like skinless. So that protects them from the UV radiation, I think from like parasites too. We'll see them, they have like lice sometimes, or like I've seen a tick embedded in a seal, but that sort of stuff just happens. In terms of the purpose of the molt, for many mammals and birds, the molt is a really critically important process for maintaining the function of their fur and feathers, or for changing the function of their fur and feathers. So for the second point, I'm talking about like breeding birds that have to like turn into like, especially males, turn into like a beautiful breeding plumage. They have to molt in order to like produce those colorful feathers. And then they don't want to be bright when it's not the breeding season, because they don't want to get eaten by predators. And so they'll lose those bright feathers and grow in drab ones. In terms of maintaining function, if you think of like a sea otter, for example, they need really high quality fur in order to survive. They're marine animals with not a lot of blubber, so they rely on their fur to stay warm. And so they're constantly like grooming themselves. And if their coat becomes less good quality, that could have a lot of implications for their survival. And so as soon as their fur gets a little old, then they want to try to like replace it with a new fur coat in order to sort of repair the function of it. So all that to say, the molt is really important, but like in elephant seals specifically, we kind of don't really understand why they molt, and especially why they molt their skin and their fur. It's probably that they lose the quality of their fur and skin because they're diving so much, and they basically like shunt their blood away from their skin and towards their like critical organs when they're diving. And so they can't really take care of their skin for like 10 months out of the year when they're during their foraging migrations. And so their fur looks pretty garbage by the end of the year. But they don't really use fur for much. So I think it's just kind of one of those things. They still have fur, so they have to replace it. But those are all very fabulous questions. Sonia, yeah,
You want me to read your next one?
sure, that'd be
This is
great.
it.
I'm like hosting my
I
own
know.
Q&A.
I know. No, it's great. And you don't have to feel rushed at all. We
Cool,
are here with you and there
great,
is no rush on our end.
amazing.
Sherry Goforth has had her hand up. I just want to, do you want to chime in and then we'll get to Sonia's question? Sherry, do you want to ask out loud?
My hand was up from one of the polls earlier.
Oh, gotcha.
Sorry about
Very
that.
good. Okay. And then Sonia is asking, how do they control reproduction if they choose not to reproduce? I would think, I know Sonia is somewhat as a bird person and like
Yeah,
thinking about bad years where
yeah,
seabirds will actually decide not to reproduce is the easiest way to say it, but
yeah.
what's happening there physiologically?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one we're still working on the answer to. I have some physiology colleagues who are really interested in what we call intermittent breeding, which is also not the right words. We try not to say choose to reproduce because we don't actually really know if they're like making a conscious decision or if their physiology is choosing for them. And um, I think that's exactly it. Like we literally don't know if they're choosing. Some of the work that's been done, I think suggests that it's a combination of the seals not getting pregnant in the first place and also seals not carrying fetuses all the way to term. Once they produce the pup, it's like like once they give birth, they've spent so much energy raising that thing through 10 months of gestation that they usually carry that through. So they'll usually take care of the pup until it weans if they can. Um, but in terms of like how many seals, never get pregnant at all versus don't, keep the pregnancy all the way to term, we don't know. Um, in the paper I showed with the behavioral strategies, the mass gain and the lifetime reproductive success, the fact that if they gain less mass, they are less likely to reproduce, that sort of suggests to me that like their body says, okay, if I'm not gaining enough energy to support this pregnancy, I'm not going to maintain the pregnancy. I'm going to, like uh sustain myself. And so that's probably what's going on for the ones that get pregnant is they aren't able to get enough energy to basically maintain that pregnancy throughout the foraging trip. But in terms of the one that don't get pregnant in the first place, it's not a lack of mating opportunities. We'll just say that. It may be that their ovulation is offset in timing, their estrus is offset in timing, their annual cycle timing is different. But we are still kind of working on the answers to those sorts of questions.
They just one thought on that with the delayed implantation,
Mhm.
health of the animal, weight gain at 3 months or whatever, if there's if there's a, I don't know if that plays
Yeah,
to it, if they've gained a bunch of weight and they're doing great 3 months out, and then
yeah,
the implantation happens then or not.
that's
But
right.
I
Yeah,
don't know. And
I
then
think your
it's
your
just
guess is as good as mine.
they're so far out there too. It's not like with what the little California sea lions and the pelicans are telling us right now, they're kind of obviously having a rough year
Yeah,
based on rescue and response to deceased ones.
yeah,
Where elephant seals, it's just like they're so far offshore that
yeah,
we get the few pups that tend to maybe just not be thriving,
yeah,
but
that's
you
right.
don't really see a lot of elephant seal, wash ashore. They're far away and they
Yeah,
disappear before they roll onto shore. But
that's exactly
let
right.
me there was a question here, Sonia, that what cues do the seals use to signal to them that it's time to return from out of migration?
Hmm.
I think you kind of
Yeah,
heard that in the beginning a little bit, but what cues might they?
cues. Yeah, cues are the holy grail of navigation science and not something that we've been able to show yet. So like generally what cues do they use to navigate? It could be celestial cues, stars, moons. It could be, um, physical landmarks. It could be magnetoreception. It could be a combination of these things. I think there's a little bit of evidence of all of those things, and it's probably some combination. Like if it's a clear night, they might use the stars. If it's not, they might use some other cue, same as our sensory systems. Like if I don't know if it's smoky out, like we will tend to obviously not use smell and we won't be able to see as well. So maybe we'll use other senses. In terms of how they decide to return, I mean, clearly they know their distance to the beach and clearly they know how much time they have to get back. And I have absolutely no idea how they do either of those two things. I thought maybe like it had to do with like the solstice, like maybe they were using like the like day length where they are, because I forget what it is. It's like at the solstice, it's always the longest day of the year wherever you are. There's some like I forget. There's some like celestial cues that people always talk about with navigation that are like wherever you are on the planet, you should be able to use this cue as a cue, but they're not. It's like some turn around early, some late, some far, some close. And so it seems like they're using distance and time together in order to make that strategic decision.
Which is phenomenal because they're targeting having a pup within 5 days of landing. And if they miss that, I mean,
Yeah.
mind-boggling.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
What's current understanding of how the mothers recognize their pups? That's a fun one.
A very good question. In short, there was a study done a couple of years ago by some colleagues where they basically did some experiments to figure out whether moms were recognizing their pups or not, and if so, how early. And they found that moms could recognize their pups, I think within like 1 or 2 days after birth. Um, and I think you should look up the paper. It's by Juliette Lenoisier. But they were doing acoustic playback experiments. So thinking about acoustic cues rather than like smell cues. Because when you're on the colony in the breeding season, all you can do is hear moms and their pups calling back and forth. And so it's clear that they're using those acoustic cues for something. And Juliette found that, yeah, they're using those pup calls for recognition of pups by the moms. So that's about all I know, but that paper is in Biology Letters in 2021, and it's a really good paper if you want to check it out if you don't already know about it.
And with smell, I'm glad you mentioned smell because with the skull of the elephant seal, one of the most frequently asked questions is what's going on in the sinus there. And the smell, are they using that to seek out food? And I said, but they're underwater, they're not smelling. They may smell on land, but they're not smelling when they're in water, are they? I mean,
No.
yeah. So, and then that
Especially not at hundreds of meters below the ocean surface. I think all their like orifices are pretty closed.
right, closed up
Yeah.
tight for now
Yeah.
because they're mammals,
Yeah.
and then picking up vibration with the whiskers.
Yeah,
But then on
exactly.
land, how do they use those sinuses? And one cool fact that I heard, like
Yeah.
if you took the tissue, the membrane that covers that sinus, the
Yeah.
sinuses, the honeycomb, you could
Yeah.
spread it out and it's huge. And do they actually use that to do the condensation of the water and get a little bit of extra hydration through that surface area?
Yeah. That I mean, I don't know, you're really digging into the depths of my knowledge, but I can tell you that especially the males during the breeding season, when it's those cold, cold, dark mornings, all you can see on the colony is like the big males standing up to make their vocalizations, to make their presence known, and just like loads of water vapor coming out. And
Yeah.
so I think they're losing a lot of water. And so any sort of respiratory evaporative water loss mitigation that they can do, I think is probably pretty helpful. But yeah, I don't know about females. They're fasting for an entire month during both breeding and molting. So they're not eating, they're not drinking. So I think whatever conservation of water they can do is probably pretty great.
Oh, so cool. And even just like you're touching on in your work, looking at how they can be used to look at ocean conditions way out there, and just that,
Yeah.
I mean, really the elephant seal, there's a lot of them, but they can
Yeah.
also crash, and
That's
they
right.
all come
That's right.
from the bottleneck. But just the importance and the extraordinary adaptability of these animals is, there's some really, dive into one of those books. I think one of the old Anya
Yeah.
Nuevo books was like,
Yeah.
reading it, and I was absolutely, blew my mind.
Yeah, isn't that so fun? I think one of the most surprising parts of our research so far has just been like elephant seals are viewed as the most robust species, like compared to California sea lions, like you're saying. Elephant seals just like, they're just like tanks, you know, they just have so much mass on them. They can really get through anything. And so to find that their demography was so sensitive to ocean conditions, I think was really surprising for us, where we were like, oh, maybe they are actually um like robust enough to survive the hard parts of, bad ocean conditions, but sensitive enough that we can measure the health of the ocean via small fluctuations in how they're doing. And that, I think, is what makes them a perfect sentinel.
Well said.
Mm.
One more question. Has avian flu begun to affect the northern elephant seals? I've heard that many thousands of southern seals have succumbed. So thank you for that question, Laura.
Yeah, great question. We're watching the southern elephant seal situation play out with absolute terror. I forget when it first started, but maybe it was like right before our breeding season in January or something. Maybe it was in the late fall, I forget, but we were all just like, we meet every week, all of the like PIs and grad students and postdocs, and um we were super nervous about this season. And we, probably sent, hundreds of emails to vets and disease experts. And the conclusion was basically like, if avian flu comes to Año Nuevo, there's not a thing you can do about it. But if you want to make yourself feel better, go ahead and like spray your boots clean before you come to the colony, and spray your boots clean after. And so we did that. And we saw a couple sort of alarming seal related things, a couple seals with like blood around their nose or mouths, which is like not normal, but figured like one of them had maybe like bonked her canine on a rock. And then another one that was kind of like had foamy blood coming from the mouth. And we were like, is this the end? Because, we care about these animals so much, and it's devastating enough to have like a whole colony of animals just die. But, for a 6-decade research program in which we're on like the 8th generation of animals, for like that sort of mass mortality to happen is like a whole nother ball game. And so it was pretty scary for us, but I'm very thrilled to say that all of the seals have now left for the molt, and they're off the beach, and they're not infecting each other with anything. And as far as we can tell, we had just the normal number of like very, very small number of mortalities that just happen. And we did take swabs for a vet at UC Davis so that she can do all sorts of avian flu testing for the animals that we handle. It's about 50 animals, and we'll see what comes out of that. But the short answer is no avian flu so far, and I really hope it stays that way.
Absolutely, for so many reasons. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Cool.
thank you so much. That was fascinating.
Yeah.
I love the longevity of the look at these animals, and from others to you and to future continuum of these animals. Um, I love that they're there and available to study and look at. And yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, nice to meet you, and I hope to see all of you at Año Nuevo sometime. It's a magical place.
Yeah. Thank you. If you're ever up here in this area, please let us know and come say hi.
I will.
Yeah.
I've always wanted to go to Fort Bragg, so it's on my bucket list.
Good, good. Please do. All right, again, thank you everyone for
All right.
being here, and thank you very much for being here, Roxanne.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Have a good night.
Good night.